And we are going to get started as all friends join us for this evening. I am Rabbi Dan Ross, and I'm here on behalf of Central Synagogue in New York City, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this program this evening, 40 years after Sophie's Choice, the Holocaust and Hollywood. In 1982, William Styron's novel Sophie's Choice premiered as a movie, one of the first popular films connected to the Holocaust. The title of the iconic book and film has become a widely used phrase, often shorthand for an impossible decision, with few knowing its origin. On this 40th anniversary of the film, we look back at its making, the controversy surrounding the film, and the connection to the sponsor of today's program, the Olga Lengel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights, also known by its acronym TOLI. We will also explore how this and other films have impacted the understanding and awareness of the Holocaust, and how Hollywood has treated the Holocaust as a film subject. There can be no doubt that programs that educate about the Holocaust are more important than ever. The number of survivors is rapidly diminishing, and surveys show a troubling decrease in what people, especially our young people, know about the Holocaust. And this is happening at a time when misinformation, disinformation, and outright denial of the Holocaust is increasing, and anti-Semitism and extremism is becoming normalized. This program has garnered a lot of interest. We've been getting regular updates on the number of registrants, and I see that we currently have over 400 people joining us in the Zoom. And that's perhaps because the topic of the Jews and Hollywood has never been in the news so much recently, and no doubt because of our esteemed panel, Holocaust scholar Michael Berenbaum, New York Times film editor Stephanie Goodman, and Rob Eshman, senior contributing editor at The Forward. After the discussion, there will be an opportunity for them to address questions, which you can put in the chat during the program. And it is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Deborah Lauder, a longtime civil and human rights leader who was recently appointed the executive director of TOLI. Good evening, Deborah. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And thank you, Rabbi, so much for the introduction and for those of you joining us today's program. Most of you are probably not aware of TOLI or its connection to Sophie's Choice. Olga Lengel was born in 1908 in Hungary and was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 1947, she published Five Chimneys, a woman survivor's true story of Auschwitz, one of the earliest published testimonies, and it depicted the barbarism of the Nazis. As the New York Times obituary of William Styron noted, Styron was haunted for years after reading Olga's book. And it opens with, and you see on your screen a picture of the cover of the book and a picture of Olga in her youth. This is Olga's opening. Mea culpa, my fault, mea maxima culpa. I cannot acquit myself of the charge that I am in part responsible for the destruction of my own parents and of my two young sons. The world understands that I could not have known, but in my heart, the terrible feeling persists that I might have saved them. Olga was referring to the decision she made to trust the Nazis when they told her that they were sending her husband, who was a doctor, to a hospital in Germany. Rather than stay in Hungary, she made the choice to bring her children and her parents along. Of course, she could not have known that they were not being sent to a hospital, but to Auschwitz. After the war, she left Europe, she was in Cuba, and then she ended up in New York and became dedicated to educating future generations about the Holocaust. Honoring her legacy, TOLI has become one of the leading providers of Holocaust education for teachers here in the United States and in Europe. We ensure that teachers have the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence to teach the Holocaust and make it relevant for our next generations. During his research for Sophie's Choice, Styron met with Olga, and he heard the wrenching stories firsthand. In 1998, Nancy Fisher, an interviewer of survivors with the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive and a Central Synagogue member, conducted a 5-hour interview with Olga that gives us insights into what may have impacted Styron's storyline. We want to show you now just a 90-second clip of that interview recounting Olga's tragic choice.
After my father was taken, it came to my children and my mother. And they said the mother should be with me and the children will be taken to another camp. So I asked, what kind of camps? They said, they are the children and old people take care of them. So I was thinking, and I know that we will be used for hard labor. And I wanted to save my mother the hard labor. And I wanted that she should take care of the children. So I asked the German, could my mother go with the children? So the German said, oh, yes, by all means, he should go. I didn't know that I condemned my mother also for that, because the children and the people going with the children were taken right away to the gas chamber. I cannot liberate myself from this moment when they were taken to death. And each night up to date, before I go asleep, these pictures appear. And since that time, I have an insomnia. I sleep very little and very troubled.
So as you hear, this story really foreshadows some of this, the creating of Sophie's Choice by William Styron, which we're going to explore now. So it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Rob Eshman, who's the senior contributing editor at The Forward. Rob served as The Forward's national editor, and prior to that, he was editor-in-chief and publisher of the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles for 17 years. Rob, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your discussion with Michael Berenbaum and with Stephanie Goodman.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to introduce our guests and then have a dialogue here with them. And I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. We might run a little bit over an hour. I'll let you know. But I will be looking at the Q&A and at the end of the session, our discussion, including some of your questions. First, our guests. Stephanie Goodman is film editor at the New York Times. After stints at Variety and the Los Angeles Times, she joined the New York Times in 2003. And Stephanie oversees film and stand-up comedy coverage at the New York Times. She's been doing that for the last 10 years. Michael Berenbaum is an American scholar, professor, rabbi, writer, filmmaker, specializes in the study of the Holocaust. He served as project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and as president and CEO of the Shoah Visual History Foundation here in LA. Subsequently and currently, he's the director of the Siggy Zerian Institute exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at American Jewish University. Michael's also co-produced Emmy and Academy Award-winning Holocaust documentary, One Survivor Remembers, and he was the chief historical consultant for Last Days, which also won an Academy Award. So he's had some experience with Holocaust movies himself. So Michael and Stephanie, are you with us? There you are. I see your faces. Hi guys.
Hi.
So I just want to start with why we're all here. Why there's been many Holocaust movies made, some before Sophie's Choice, many since Sophie's Choice. Why does that movie still resonate? Why are people still talking about it decades later?
Stephanie, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go
I was
first?
going to ask you if you wanted to go first. Sure. I mean, partly it's just the powerful performances that, it's really a phenomenal performance by Meryl Streep. It's where she pretty much cemented her reputation, even though she'd been in award-winning films and had won an Oscar before. This is really where we understood her greatness. It helps that Kevin Kline and Peter MacNicol match her in the tremendousness of their performances. And then the story itself is incredibly moving and it's a very stark story in some ways, but it has a lot of nuance, and it's filmed beautifully. I mean, it's sort of awkward to talk about Holocaust movies and beautiful filming, but you really can't avoid it here. Michael, what do you think?
Well, we have to say a couple of things. Number one, it came at a time when the public was becoming open to Holocaust films. Came after the docudrama, The Holocaust. And then Meryl Streep did something incredible in preparation, which is that she prepared herself for the role by learning German and learning Polish, and studied that. And you saw the power of her presentation. It also had a way that was accessible to the American public because we saw it through the eyes of William Styron's surrogate, who was essentially a Southern boy trying to make his way in New York as a writer, and experiencing these two people who were larger than life, tragic, deeply tragic people. And the most interesting moment of that, which we all know, is ironically a moment that Styron would not touch in his novel. And Meryl Streep was able to do it all with a minimum of vocabulary and a maximum of performance. And that is that if you read Sophie's Choice, the novel, at that moment, Styron backs away from that. At the critical moment, Styron says, what manner of a man would ask a woman to choose between her two children? And then he goes into, ironically, an entire theory of the Holocaust and slavery. That was the moment in his writing he couldn't touch it. He couldn't go there. And Meryl Streep, in what may be the most incredible 3 minutes of performance by anybody that I've seen, goes there, but she goes there with very, very few words and only the anguish on her face.
That sets us up for the next question, and also to actually show that scene. But I had read in preparation for this that they actually, an interview with the girl who played her daughter, and that they actually, who's now 40 years old and living in Paris, and they actually shot that. They did 13 takes of a scene that was so emotionally wrenching. I couldn't believe it. But Jen, maybe you could play that scene, and then we'll kick off the next set of questions.
Du bist keine Kommunistin? Du bist eine Gläubige.
Ja, mein Hauptmann. Ich glaube an Christus.
Du glaubst an Christus, den Erlöser?
Ja.
Sagt er nicht, lasst doch die Kinder und verwehret ihnen nicht, zu mir zu kommen. Hm? Du kannst eins von den Kindern behalten.
Wie bitte?
Du kannst eins von den Kindern behalten. Das andere muss weg.
Wollen Sie mir sagen, dass ich wählen muss?
Du bist ein Polak und kein Jude. Also, hast ein gewisses Vorrecht.
Ich kann nicht wählen. Ich kann nicht wählen.
Halt's Maul.
Ich kann nicht wählen.
Komm, ich schicke sie beide weg. Ich schicke beide Kinder weg.
Nein,
Ja doch, du musst
zwingen
wählen.
Sie mich nicht zu wählen.
Komm,
Ich kann nicht wählen.
Und ich schicke sie beide darüber.
Nein!
Halt's Maul, halt. Hör auf jetzt. Du sollst das Maul halten.
Nein!
Los, entscheide dich, wähle.
Nein! Zwingen Sie mich nicht zu wählen. Ich kann nicht wählen.
Ich schick sie beide darüber.
Nicht wählen.
Nehmen Sie beide Kinder weg. Ja, siehst dich! Los!
Nehmen Sie meine Kleine!
So, Michael, this raises so many questions, but one is we had just seen the clip with Olga, and Olga really didn't have a choice. So what does it mean at all that there is a Sophie's choice? Because for all the Jews, there really wasn't. I think it was you or some Holocaust scholar said it was really a choiceless choice. But what is Styron's trying to do here by presenting this as a choice?
Let's begin by saying that, first of all, we should explain what choiceless choice is. The term was introduced by Lawrence Langer, and it says, normally in life, we're choosing between good and bad, or between something that is terrible and something that is less terrible. The survivors, the victims of the Holocaust had what he called choiceless choices between something that was impossible, terrible, horrific, outrageous, and something equally horrible, terrible, outrageous, horrific, frightening, etc. Once he explained that, it means that those of us from the outside can't use our ordinary characteristics of judgment to do that, because it's not of their own doing, it's a situation they find themselves. For those of us who are Holocaust scholars, that's a scene that probably could not have happened. And that is that the people who were deported to Birkenau, if they were Jewish, women and children were separated from men. Women with children were sent directly to their death, and only the young and the able-bodied were selected to work until they were worked ultimately to their death. Poles did not face that situation of death, but Styron didn't quite know that. Styron also did not know, when he was writing the book, that Olga was Jewish. And that is, he did not know that for a fact. In fact, at several points, he claimed that she was not Jewish. And I, for one, corrected him to his surprise. But he, again, when he was writing this, he thought he was honoring, and I know this from my own discussions with him, he thought he was honoring the Jewish experience by not making it a Jewish victim. And some people criticized him for putting a non-Jewish victim at the centerpiece. In fact, in a new book, a fellow by Ronald Bronstein, not the columnist, but another fellow by Ron Bronstein, said it's not a Holocaust film because it doesn't deal with the Jews. Of course, it's a Holocaust film because it deals with Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is the capital of evil during the Holocaust. But that's a moment that, in all likelihood, could not have happened to a non-Jew. But nevertheless, it makes for enormously powerful film, and her performance at that moment, as well as his performance at that moment, is just extraordinary. And
Stephanie, this is I mean, this comes up in film criticism all the time, but does that delegitimize it in some ways, the fact that he's taking such liberties with the actual history, or is that part of what actually gives it that extra power, that he was able to go there in his imagination? And then,
well, I think that's part of the film's power on viewers, is that you don't necessarily, it allows non-Jews to feel that they could be in that position as well. It allows them empathy. I mean, it's certainly a criticism that has dogged the movie. I certainly don't see that it's of course a Holocaust film. I think that when you look, it's a powerful emotional film that when you're watching it in the moment, can't look away. But when you start thinking about it deeper, there are certainly things that are troublesome. Having a non-Jew at the center of it allows us, in some ways, the way she's lit, the angles, the camera framing allows us to sort of ignore the Jews that are surrounding her in the flashback scenes, or to so there's that. There's the fact that Kevin Kline's character, he's Jewish, but he's sort of unhinged.
The Jews in this movie are not the most pleasant. And then there's the girlfriend who's kind of a Jewish princess stereotype.
Yes, and the landlady is sort of she's not necessarily a stereotype, but she's sort of a lightweight. She's sort of dismissed as kind of a silly woman. And so they're troubling. To be honest, the powerful performances really go a long way to cut against this. And so you tend to not think about it when you're watching the movie. But I do think it's somewhat troubling.
Yeah. Did it bother you, Mike? I mean, you're a Holocaust historian, and this is kind of an ahistorical depiction of the Holocaust.
Again, the question is, does it bother me? And the question is, did I appreciate the magnitude of the film? And I would say yes to both.
Right.
But
both can be true.
Both can be true at the same time. And I also appreciated, again, this is a film based on a novel. And Styron was one of America's finest novelists. And I always said of Styron, I said it to his face, that word for word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, page for page, he was one of the great stylists as a novelist. I sometimes thought the plot was not equal to his talent, but he had to see it. Remember, this is a Southern man who had done a lot of work on slavery. And the only way he could approach this was through the lens of slavery. And Auschwitz was a unique manifestation of slavery, if we go to the substance of Auschwitz, because Auschwitz itself reduced the slave in America. And none of this, all of this comparison is not to, God forbid, minimize the horror of American slavery. But in American slavery, the slave was a capital investment, worthy of continuing in life in order to get greater return on your investment, worthy of procreating because the slave then produced more capital investments. In Auschwitz, the slave was a consumable raw material to be discarded in the process of manufacture and recycled. In other words, they didn't want, they wanted to drain all mineral life from those who were still capable of work. They didn't give them enough to survive. They didn't give them adequate shelter. They didn't give them adequate food. They recycled them. And then when they murdered them, and even before they murdered them, they took their hair, they took their gold from the teeth. They even used the ashes to salt the roads and to fertilize the fields. So the slave became disposable. And if you go it from my perspective as a scholar who's written, considerably on Auschwitz, German corporations invested 700 million Reichsmarks in 1944 in Auschwitz alone. And that meant that they built it to last, presuming that slaves were going to be a permanent part of the German economy. So Styron had every right to approach it from the angle of slavery. And it was the natural way for him to approach it, given everything else he had done. And in one sense, knowing him, I could not imagine he would have gone in a different direction if he was approaching Auschwitz.
Well, this is a question that raises a question I was going to ask later, but it's so apropos now. There's been a lot of Holocaust movies, and I wonder if you think they've kind of paved the way, or what their relationship is to this new crop of slavery movies that in some ways has, well, I'll leave it open-ended that way, but there's been 12 Years a Slave and the new movie Emancipation, and there's been kind of a revisiting of slavery in Hollywood from the slave perspective. And I'm wondering if you think in some ways Holocaust movies paved the way for that you could make a movie that will bring in audiences, that will even make money because it's a business, that are about these most horrific events in history?
Well, let's go back. In I think it's 76, Roots appeared.
Right.
And all of a sudden, it's either 76 or 77, and all of a sudden, and television is a mainstream phenomenon. In those days, television was 5 or 6 channels, and you had a mainstream phenomenon. You had to appeal to a very broad audience. All of a sudden, Roots appeared. Roots was then accessible to the American people. They watched it. That paved the way all of a sudden to say that people are interested if you tell a human story, if you tell a personal story, if you do it well enough to engage the audience. People are interested in learning about experiences that are not their own and that may be very, very far in distance from their own. So Roots opened up the possibility of Black experience becoming part of American life. The Holocaust, the docudrama, despite any controversy about it, opened up the way for the Holocaust to be of interest. And the Holocaust has continued to be of interest for, in one sense, we could say that the afterlife of the Holocaust was more impactful than the actual revelations of the Holocaust. It's grown in importance over the past 75 years.
And
I would agree that Roots kind of paved the way for slavery narratives, which honestly, there are some problematic issues with the slavery narrative genre as in Hollywood. But I would also say that the recent spate of movies that you're pointing to, like 12 Years a Slave and Emancipation, I think those stem more from a realization in Hollywood that people of color were being denied the chance to tell their stories, and it's more of a these new narratives stem from an opening of access to people of color, not necessarily because of Holocaust dramas, I would say.
Sophie's choice kind of ends on that. You mentioned the narrative, the Peter McNichols narrative, which really takes you through the movie. And it ends on this kind of elegiac, almost uplifting note. Morning is coming in Brooklyn. He's walking across the bridge. And there's this genre, it seems that Holocaust movies, a lot of them have that, belong to that kind of genre where there's an uplift at the end, compared to the actual Holocaust when there is no actual uplift at the end. And I mean, you could maybe put Schindler's List in that same category even.
Americans love a happy ending.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of you get a green light in Hollywood. If you're going to have a downer ending, it's going to be a tough to get a green light.
And yet, I mean, I'm thinking of The Gray Zone and some of those movies where it's just kind of relentlessly bleak. They do get made, but do those, are those movies giving you an inherently inaccurate kind of take on the Holocaust if they do kind of bring you to this uplift?
Let's go backwards, Rob, and say it a different way. The Gray Zone was a historically accurate treatment of the very limited humanity that was possible for Sonderkommando, those who worked in the vicinity of the gas chambers. Meaning that if you read their testimony, and I've read hundreds of testimonies of virtually every survivor Sonderkommando who's given testimony, they speak of themselves as automatons. They speak of themselves as robots. They speak of themselves as having the most limited way for humanity. And part of what happens in the Gray Zone is the Gray Zone has very great difficulty. It tries to remain faithful to their experience and has great difficulty capturing their humanity, because their humanity is very, very, very narrow. I'll give you one example. 500,000 people were killed at Belzhitz, and there's only one known testimony by a man by the name of Rudolf Redder. There are only two known survivors. Redder is the only one who gave testimony. And he spoke, he said, only when I heard a child, he spoke about what he heard coming out of the gas chamber. Only when I heard a child say, "Mommy, it's cold, I'm scared. Mommy, haven't I been good?" Only then did I have some feeling. And later I could no longer feel. Now you have to take that very seriously. And in fact, we did that testimony for the museum at Belzhitz. And the late Theodore Bickel read it. They read it in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. And when he read it in Yiddish, everybody which was the language in which it was experienced in one sense, everybody was in tears, even those who didn't understand the language.
Right, right. But that movie had a Jewish protagonist, and I'm wondering that when I think of the two most successful Holocaust movies, or the most successful, among the most successful, I think of Schindler's List, I think of Sophie's Choice. And one thing that strikes me is, you know, you have these gorgeous Gentile actors playing the leads in both. And both main characters are not Jews. I mean, don't play Jews, and they're not Jews. And is that kind of, Stephanie, do you see that as kind of the necessary?
I think that's key to their success, at least in the United States. I think that Liam Neeson in Schindler's List allows a viewer to imagine what they might have done in the Holocaust. They might have been Liam Neeson, who's sort of he's sort of a man about town, a ladies' man, a kind of off the cuff, against the grain guy. And it's easy to imagine wanting to be that person and entering the story that way. And so I think that is one of the keys to why that film was so really wildly successful. You know, even Liam Neeson wasn't that well known at the time when that film came out, and just really, it didn't even matter that he wasn't that well known. Whereas Meryl Streep, I think in Sophie's Choice, there's something of like a star power or at work in that film too.
Yeah.
But
How long did it take Hollywood to actually do a movie or something about the Holocaust? When was the first?
There were actually movies in the 40s and 50s, just a few, not many, like not well known. Something called The Juggler with Kirk Douglas, and The Search with Montgomery Clift. And then there was The Pawnbroker with Rod Steiger. That's
but the Pawnbroker was a 60s movie.
Yeah, no, I know, 60s.
And the Pawnbroker was fascinating as a movie. It was one of the most difficult movies to see because survivors were depicted as damaged goods. There's a juxtaposition between Sol Nazarman and the father of one of the women he's with, who calls him a coward because you're not surviving, you're enduring, and talks of something very different. In the 50s, there were a couple of movies. First of all, Diary of Anne Frank.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes, I should have
Diary of Anne Frank became very important.
Yeah.
You also had something that we saw twice. You had Judgment at Nuremberg. That first was a television play on Playhouse 90 and had a very peculiar moment in it, which only could happen on television in those days, which is that it was sponsored by the American Gas Company.
Jesus.
And they bleeped out the word murder by, and the only word that the audience heard was murder by gas, and the like. And 2 years later, it became the Spencer Tracy movie, which was again Judgment at Nuremberg.
And then did the TV series Holocaust kind of open up?
I think that showed that it could be a subject that millions of people would watch and tune into. I mean, it still was a couple years before Sophie's Choice came along, but yeah, no, I even remember it as a kid, that being a something that everybody tuned into. It was kind of an event.
Look, it was seen by more than 50%. One or another of the evenings was seen by more than 50% of the American television watching public. And the joke in New York City was that during the intermissions, the water pressure went down because so many people they either went to the bathroom or they went to the kitchen and poured themselves a glass of something. It broke, and it had a tremendous influence. The irony is we just did a documentary on the impact of the docudrama The Holocaust in Germany. And I made a very cynical statement, which is that it had more impact than the original in Germany, which was not meant, was meant with all the irony that it implies. But it had a tremendous impact. It also had an impact on one audience that was tremendous, had an impact on survivors themselves, who suddenly felt that they had a story to tell and that the American people were interested in listening. It also coincided with the moment that we had, and we'll take in ancient history, Rob, where you had the battle between Beta and VHS, but all of a sudden you could film people or tape people inexpensively, and it was accessible to everybody. So survivors began to speak because they felt people were interested in listening, and that became a defining moment.
And it seems like part of it was it also proved to Hollywood, to the industry, that you could actually make money on these, that there was this wasn't like an education, just an educational service to the public.
I mean, for many decades, Hollywood had spent a lot of time trying to just pretend that that a studio executive wasn't Jewish or that a star wasn't Jewish, and so this was sort of a real radical shift for them to acknowledge that on screen.
It's a shift that came in context. Remember, this is a time where we were developing a series of ethnic pride. The Black Was Beautiful movement also indicated a moment in the Jewish experience in which all of a sudden Jews were proud of manifesting their Jewishness and the like. Rob, let's touch on one thing. We should mention that Elie Wiesel deeply criticized the docudrama The Holocaust. It was obscene, it was absurd.
Well, he criticized Sophie's Choice as well.
And he criticized Schindler's List too.
He criticized Sophie's Choice. He did not criticize the novel. He always distinguished between the novel and the movie. And part of that was given Styron's reputation and given Styron's prominence, Wiesel had respect for another writer in a way that he didn't have to respect the film that was made.
Right. But I think his quote about Sophie, you probably know this better than I do, but I think it was that if it's about everybody, then it's not about anybody.
Yeah,
that
but
if you try to universalize the Holocaust through this movie, then you're really it does a disservice to the idea that this was it was about Jews.
But Rob, we were wrestling with that all the way through at that point, and Wiesel was afraid, deeply afraid, profoundly afraid of the de-Judaization of the Holocaust, that the Jewish story would be subsumed in other stories and people would forget that the victims were Jews. Part of what we did, and ultimately it happened without him when we shaped the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, was to say that the only way the Jewish story could be understood is if we understood the victimization of non-Jews by the Nazis. So, for example, you could not talk about the origin of gas chambers without talking about the murder of the handicapped in the T4 operation. And you could not talk about the origin of concentration camps, the origin of death camps, unless you spoke of the origin of concentration camps, which were originally for political prisoners, dissidents, social democrats, and communists. And only in 1938 did Jews, after the November pogroms known as Kristallnacht, were Jews a majority element. So Wiesel had a fear, a deep and profound fear. And in order to reach a general audience, you have to deal with the multiple characters who were victimized in this process, and to be faithful to the Holocaust and to the Jewish memory of the Holocaust, you have to understand what they share in common and where they differ with the experience of other people. I mean, I have scars in my career up and down my back to show you for establishing that, and it's now universally understood within the field. Maybe not by non-scholars, but everybody in the field understands that at this point.
Yeah, I think Wiesel's other quote, and I'm probably butchering it, was that you could do a novel, you could write a novel about Auschwitz, but it's either, any novel about Auschwitz is either not a novel or not about Auschwitz. In other words, fiction cannot get at the truth of what actually happened in the Holocaust. And
by the way, nor in Wiesel's mind could anything quite get there. In other words, Wiesel had a paradox which left all of us, and most especially Hollywood creators, impotent. He said, only those who were there will ever know, and those who were there can never tell. And we had to essentially, and I worked very closely with him, we had to understand to respect what the survivor knew, because you and I and Stephanie will never know what it's like to be hungry when you ate in 1941 and you ate again in 1945. You and I will never know what it's like to be cold in October and not get warm again until late May, thankfully. And it's something.
So if a movie can never get to that, is there an educational, what's the educational impact of these Holocaust movies? I'm thinking of a movie, Stephanie, like Inglourious Bastards, which I think was one of my favorite Holocaust, if I, in that genre, I think my favorite, and certainly my favorite movie the year it came out. And it's got nothing to do with, it's a fable, it's fabulous. It's got nothing to do with the truth.
As long as, but
do
Rob,
movies educate us, Stephanie?
I mean, I don't know whether like Inglourious Bastards can educate us, but I do think I guess in some respects you could say that it counteracts stereotypes, where in a lot of these movies we're talking like in Sophie's Choice or even in Schindler's List, there's not a lot of agency by the Jewish characters. It's often the Gentiles who are taking action on our behalf, and it's a little frustrating. It's like that's not historical, and it's not really a reflection of at all of our lives. And so seeing the Inglourious Bastards characters take action is deeply satisfying for a Jewish viewer. And I think it could be educational for a Gentile viewer who might subscribe to stereotypes. But in terms of, I do think the education factor is, in Inglourious Bastards at least, is maybe secondary to the countering of stereotypes that goes on.
But Michael, what educational value do these movies have if they can't really get to the truth?
Well, let me go back to Inglourious Bastard for a moment. Look, sure. there was enormous Jewish agency, meaning action on the part of the Jews, that has a true story in what is called the Ritchie Boys, and the use of German and Austrian Jewish refugees who had come to the United States and to Great Britain and to Australia, who went back as the lead interrogators at Nuremberg, as mayors of small and middle-sized cities, as the lead intelligence units who went over the Rhine and created the situation. Those are enormously important stories. Tarantino took it to the extreme, to an event that didn't happen. But we have to understand Tarantino's quality as a storyteller, that the father, and I'm trying to remember his name for one moment, the father of the man who assassinated Adolf Hitler in the movie. I was there. Now, you may have been there as well. The father of that man, who was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. So let's presume for a moment he's not a slouch. Jumped up in enormous pride at the fact that his kid killed Hitler, and wrote an article for your newspaper, the newspaper you edited, of, I know it didn't happen, but I was enormously proud that my kid killed Hitler. And he realized that it was every Jewish boy's fantasy to have assassinated Adolf Hitler. And that was the power of Tarantino's storytelling. Look, it makes people, what's its educational value? Number one, we can approximate the truth all the way through. I mean, I keep writing on this area, and I get deeper and deeper into it, and we approximate the truth. Films develop an interest in this, which for some people is a starting point, and for some people it's an opportunity, and for some people it's an opening. And people come back to this material because in our life, we face life and death maybe once or twice in life, if at all. And they faced life and death choices and non-choices almost on a daily basis. And they had to endure the most extreme imaginable. And consequently, it becomes the stuff that when people come to me and ask me how to do a Holocaust film, my first statement is, don't feel the obligation to add drama. Let the drama come forth. Don't
right.
And don't think you have to go in the maximum. You just have to offer it in all of its fragmentation and like, and look at some of the European films that have been done, and most especially recently in some of the Hungarian films, both 1945 and Son of Saul, which do very little but say very much.
Right.
In 1945, you learn the whole story of the Holocaust by two religious Jews who are returning with something in a coffin, and the whole town relives its own experience in it and goes absolutely mad, and they bury it and then reboard a train. And something dramatic has happened. Son of Saul revisits what shades of the gray zone.
Yeah.
But does it in a very interesting way, also through an event that could not have happened. They're looking for a rabbi to say the Kaddish. Virtually any Jew from Eastern Europe, almost without exception, could recite the Kaddish. I mean, you didn't need a rabbi, you didn't need anybody, of any great education. 95% of the Jews could recite the Kaddish.
Stephanie, you pointed this out, you raised this issue a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to, it seems to me that as Jews have gotten more comfortable in society with their Jewishness, Holocaust movies have kind of been more comfortable pushing boundaries of what's acceptable. I mean, I guess the best example would be The Producers, where you could actually do a flat out, Mel Brooks felt so, he did a comedy, and then lately Jojo Rabbit. I don't know if if that kind of belongs to that. And then this other genre which you had raised, which is kind of the defiant Jew genre, which seems to have taken off in the last 20 years with Defiance and several. I think there was one about a Jewish boxer that came out this year. Do you see what accounts for that development of that kind of subgenre of Holocaust movie?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what accounts for it. I do think that there's a sense that among some filmmakers, not nearly all, but that the Holocaust drama genre has been explored extensively, and there might be other ways to go. I think, it's sort of awkward to say, but the Holocaust is sort of irresistible in terms of storytelling material, because it's such a stark choice between good and evil, and it's quite
Michael was saying, right.
right. I mean, we're in an era in Hollywood where Marvel reigns, and the key thing about Marvel is that it's about good fighting evil, and there's some layers of subtlety, but not a lot. So I see that this idea, this sort of fantasy genre that you're talking about, is sort of almost an outgrowth of that, sort of looking at how we can be superheroes in a way.
Well, I mean, we could do another hour on just how the Holocaust is portrayed or plays out in movies that aren't Holocaust movies. I mean, including Marvel movies, or including
right.
Jones, right?
The X-Men is there's a backstory set it in the Holocaust. Yeah, so absolutely, it's often a key thing that. Is
there any evidence, Michael, that these movies help sensitize people to anti-Semitism or in the fight against anti-Semitism?
When I meet people who are studying the Holocaust seriously, one of the ways they get into this is by virtue of movies that they saw. That, by the way, we can see that as an ongoing experience from 1945 onward. Susan Sontag has a description of being in the movies. In those days, you went to a double feature. Your parents deposit, this is before television, your parents deposit you in the movies on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, and you had a double feature with an intermission, and during the intermission they had newsreels. And she saw the newsreels from the camps, and she said, something of me started crying then and never stopped. So movies was one of the real ways in which the Holocaust was communicated in its original thing when Americans discovered, and they didn't discover the death camps, they discovered the concentration camps where victims had come from the death marches. So movies are an essential ingredient. The other thing we have is, I think that Jews today feel a greater freedom to be able to do a Jewish movie in a way they did not before. Whether that will be true in 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. But for a period of time, Jews who have always been present in Hollywood have felt a greater freedom to do Jewish films. And essentially, when Spielberg did that with Schindler's List, that also meant that other filmmakers of lesser prominence could feel free to try their hand in something like that. And they each wanted to do their own great creation. So there's been a tremendous interest. And remember, film is also it's one of the great storytelling mechanisms of the world.
Mm-hmm.
When I create museums, I say, what is the difference between a museum, a storytelling museum, and a film? A film has a captive audience, captive audience in moving imagery. And a museum has a moving audience in captive imagery. So we have to drive people along by the nature of the narrative and by the power of the story. Now, somebody just wrote that they found the producers totally offensive. Let me say that if you ask Mel Brooks about the producers, Mel Brooks will deny that he ever made a film, that he ever made fun of the Holocaust. But if you ask him, and what about making fun of Hitler? He said, let's go. In other words, he said, I've never, and I interviewed him, I was there when we interviewed him. He said, I've never made fun of the Holocaust. I will never make fun of the Holocaust. Making fun of Hitler, let me add it, because in a very real sense, what does comedy do at some of its greatest moments? It is the fury of the oppressed who takes down the oppressor, if not in actual fact, then at least in what?
Right,
Europe.
with the weapons we have.
Yeah.
How do you think these movies, I mean, I wonder the importance of these movies, or if these movies will change once the last of the survivors dies. Like, do you think, will we still be, is there something about either an urgency to do them now while there still are survivors and we could still get their stories, or will there be less of these because kind of the Holocaust will dissipate? And I guess, do you think that has any impact on it, Stephanie?
I mean, I think it will to some extent, in the sense that you don't have that immediate source of storytelling, but I feel like especially in the documentary world, the impulse to try to track down sources, like you don't necessarily need to hear directly from a survivor to tell a story. I actually wanted to go back to a point that Michael had raised about storytelling, which is that I think that a lot of these films go to the Holocaust is so unfathomable, and what storytelling is about is trying to help us make sense of the world, make sense of our lives. And I think that the filmmakers are storytellers, and they will continue to wrestle with the Holocaust because it is so unfathomable, and it presents sort of this need to make sense of it in a way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's the worst Holocaust movie you've ever seen? Anybody willing to go there?
Well, I got a long list.
Give me one. Which one?
The boy in the striped pajamas hits me as one of them.
Yeah, I gotta say, somebody brought up in the chat, Life is Beautiful. I honestly really dislike that film. I really think that's
I mean, controversial in some ways for all the ways that Sophie's Choice was, but also just a film that rubbed people the wrong way. Because why, Stephanie?
Just because it is so patently trying to get us to go along with its pretense in a way that it's, look, Sophie's Choice, you may disagree with what it's doing, but it's not trying to convince you of anything. It's put the story is put out there for you to take in or not. But
right.
Life is Beautiful is just trying to be manipulative as all get out.
Well, let me ask you a question about Life is Beautiful. Would you distinguish between the first half of it and the second half of it? In other words, the pre-camp experience versus
honestly, I don't remember it in the level of detail that I can say.
I found it I won't say enjoyable. I found it fascinating as an approach. I found it fascinating as approach for the first half, and then I found it deeply and profoundly problematic about the second half.
Yeah.
Once he got into the camp. And I also found it ironically, I found the ending of the reunion with his mother coming out of camp looking as breathtakingly beautiful as she did at the very beginning, just, was trivial. I also found that however much I liked the first half, when I saw his behavior at the Academy Award, I lost all.
There's that too. I mean, I wasn't even factoring that.
I wanted to ask you both for our last question. I wanted to ask you on the flip side, what is the one or two Holocaust movies that you recommend to people that they see if they want to just what is the Holocaust movie? If people could only see one or two, what would you recommend? And I'm going to ask the people who are on the participating in this if they could put their answer in the Q&A or in the chat, because I'm just curious, and then I'll throw it back to Deborah to close out. But who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I mean, I see somebody put in Shoah, and I certainly understand that response, absolutely. But for myself, I would probably say Schindler's List, which has an economy of storytelling imagery that is just amazing. Like in the first 20 minutes, it gets across so much with very little dialogue and through amazing editing. And then there's this Agnieszka Holland movie, In Darkness. I don't know if you know that movie, Michael. I just remember it being quite good. It was set in Poland, in the sewers in Poland. I would recommend that.
Yeah.
Michael?
Well, I will, I made all of my classes when I taught the Holocaust, most especially at Georgetown. I made all of my classes see Shoah. And I thought, and I had the unique experience. I bought the outtakes of Shoah for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and ironically in partnership with Yad Vashem, though we didn't know it because Claude Lanzmann had sold them twice. Typical of Claude Lanzmann, and finally we negotiated the fact that as long as we had them so that they could be used, forever, it didn't matter who possessed the original film, just that the material.
Right.
So I saw all 250 hours of outtakes of Shoah. I spent several weeks in Paris seeing all of that. And when you see what he had as raw material to what he ultimately shaped into a film, and he did 4 or 5 other films on that basis, and also did more films are being done now out of Shoah. You see what a masterpiece of documentary film footage, film material it is.
Hey, Michael,
And-
so I'm going to press you on what is the non-documentary movie that you most recommend or most admire?
Well, I'll tell you the answer about that, Rob, which is I have 4 children, and I don't have a favorite child. I normally have a least favorite child, depending on the hour, but I love very different things about each of my 4 kids. So if you ask me to choose one, I won't say what my favorite is. I will say that there are several great ones that I would look at for seeing different aspects of the Holocaust. And let's leave it. Let's duck that question.
Okay, I see in the chat there's The Pianist got a lot of votes, Schindler's List, Night and Fog, Some Life is Beautiful, but I'm going to turn this back over to Deborah. Thank you both. This has just been a fascinating discussion and something we could talk about for hours more, I'm sure. Deborah?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for hosting this. This was really an incredibly fascinating, excellent discussion. So thank you for it. And I also want to thank, I've been following the questions in the chat and in the questions, very thoughtful. I'm struck by one that was posted early on about, how do we use a film like this to ask, where are we? Who are we? And what will we do when we are faced with inhuman things that happen? And it's precisely that kind of critical thinking that TOLI works with teachers so that they can help our students look at the Holocaust, not just through the facts and the history, but really thinking about their own roles in society and how they would stand up to prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism today. So just thank you all. We had over 1,100 people register for this program. And I know many will be watching afterwards. So there clearly is a lot of interest, and just want to thank you all for your participation at this time, and to wish you all happy holidays, and may 2023 be a safe and healthy new year for all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.